Good afternoon. It's Friday, April 2nd, Good Friday of Easter weekend, the seventh night of Passover, the celebration of Qingming Festival on Sunday, April 4th, and Ramadan begins on April 13th. And today is the School of Education's April Doctoral Colloquium. I'm Kathy Geller, the faculty moderator this afternoon, and we're pleased to welcome all of our virtual attendees, including School of Education faculty, staff, and students, the university body at large, community members, and partner associations, amongst others. The Doctoral Student Colloquium series offers School of Education doctoral students an opportunity to share their original research and learn from peers, faculty, and staff. Each month, one PhD student and one EdD student presents their research at the colloquium, which due to COVID-19 pandemic is being held currently only through Zoom. Each doctoral student presenter has also written a research brief that relates to his or her presentation. And this is included in an annual monograph entitled Doctoral Student Research Briefs and published in the current year on the School of Education website. The research brief is a way to disseminate our doctoral students' research as shared in the colloquium in a concise format with relevance to education. If you're interested in seeing the briefs from today and prior sessions, the link has been posted to the chat box. Today, each presenter will be provided 20 minutes to share their research. We will then move on to a short question and answer dialogue following each presentation. We ask that you save your questions for the end. You are welcome to type your questions in the chat area of Zoom, or when invited at the conclusion of the presentation to use your mic to ask the question. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first presenter today, who's a second-year PhD student, Yiyun Kate Fan, whose current research is entitled Exploring Schooling and Networking in COVID-19 Using Twitter Data. As a second-year PhD student, Kate is presently serving as a research assistant in the Glide Lab and the Method Lab. Her research interests center around learning sciences, educational technology, learning analytics, and quantitative methods in mostly higher education settings. Kate is passionate about applying interdisciplinary perspectives and bringing new state-of-the-art analytical approaches to address educational issues. For that reason, in addition to her School of Education studies, Kate is actively pursuing a minor in data science from the College of Computing and Informatics. Born and raised in southern China, Ms. Fan earned her Bachelor of Arts in English at Fudan University in Shanghai, China. She earned her Master of Science in Higher Ed from the University of Pennsylvania. Kate's professional work experience includes online education, instructional design, and student life. Over to you, Ms. Fan.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen first. I hope everybody can see it clearly. And thank you so much for being here. I hope all of you had a great start of the new term. My presentation today is exploring schooling and networking in COVID-19 using Twitter data. And here is the outline of my presentation. I have presented part of this in class, so for those who have heard of similar content, I apologize. But here in this presentation, I specifically added some preliminary findings as something new. I also want to mention that this is very much a work in progress and something that I hope to eventually develop into my dissertation study. And we know that COVID-19 has disrupted normal school activities and created this new normal in education. And one of the most significant changes it brings is to push schools and universities adopt online or hybrid mode and to amp up their safety protocols. And meanwhile, we see increasing coverage of high-speed internet and growing social media usage. Popular social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook have become places for increasing interactions, debate, source of information, and support. And there are three areas of literature that back up my study. The first area concerns education in emergencies. I want to make it more generalizable, not only focusing on COVID-19, because the pandemic is not the first instance of education in crisis. And we see some past literature on past events of education emergencies, such as SARS and Ebola. There are actually many common challenges and strategies that utilized in these different education in crisis. And COVID-19 is peculiar in terms of its persistence, scale, and fatality. There are also studies in the past and present about implications of schools transitioning to this remote online modality. And the second area of literature concerns with informal professional development and communities for educators. These literatures are based mostly on social cultural perspective. And teachers have been developing their knowledge as well as their social capital in these informal occasions, such as social media grouping, blogging, online forums, etc. Many educators have been engaging with these activities on a daily basis, and there are multiple advantages associated with informal activities, as these are more flexible, more low cost, and more self-initiated. And the third areas of literature surrounds the role of social media in informal professional development and networking. Since the pandemic, social media has been a place for educators and educational community at large to seek and share resources and support. Researchers in the past have categorized different types of support online to informational and non-informational or emotional support. We can see these themes actually manifested in my findings as well. And research-wise, we see social media has become an increasing important data source for social science research because it's rich in information, could contain valuable insights about people's interests and their concerns regarding a significant social event or context, be it like a Black Lives Matter social movement or the pandemic itself. And here are some bullet points about my problem statement. So I divide my problem statement into challenges, opportunities, and the gaps. So we already talked about the challenges posed by COVID-19 and similar education in crisis context. And with the challenges comes the opportunities, and mostly social media serves as a platform for informal professional development, networking, and sharing support. It also serves as a source of information for research. But in the literature, we see gaps in our understanding of social media discourse and educational network in the context of crisis. We also do not have enough literature, especially in educational research, that applies proper methods to take advantage of the rich information from social media, especially at a large scale. So this is where my study comes in. My research purpose is to explore the features and involvement of educational network and internet discourse regarding schooling during the course of the pandemic on social media. And here I chose Twitter specifically. And the image shows the increasing user base of Twitter. And I chose it over Facebook and other platforms because Twitter is more formal and encourages text-based debate. It also has open policy for data sharing for research purposes. And my research questions are twofold. First main question is, what are the common topics discussed among educational stakeholders on social media regarding schooling in the COVID-19 pandemic? It has two sub-questions. The first sub-question concerns the involvement and the longitudinal changes of this discourse over time. And the second sub-question is about the impact of pandemic on teaching and learning according to social media discourse. And the second main question I have is the features of social networks and communities for educational stakeholders on Twitter in the pandemic. So educational stakeholders here are defined broadly as anyone who has posted educational related tweets in a specified time frame as identified in my data set. These can be teachers, students, parents, school leaders, etc. Schooling here is defined as any formal educational activities in K-12 and higher education. So I realized that the preliminary findings I have so far are not enough to address these questions fully. And in the future, I'll need more data and more mature conceptual framework going forward if I'm going to turn it into a well-developed dissertation study. And now I'm going to talk briefly about my research design and paradigm. It's an explanatory sequential mixed method design. I will start with a heavy focus on quantitative analysis to extract the most salient themes from a large quantity of data, and as well as social network analysis to explore the features of educational network. Then I will follow it up with a qualitative discourse analysis to better explain and understand what I found from quantitative phrase. And since it's an interdisciplinary study from the social science perspective, it can be framed as exploratory data analysis research, or EDA. The uniqueness of my research design is that the data exists already out there, and the goal is to not to collect the data actively through experiment, survey, or standardized tests that are usually used in educational research, but to try to provide the structure to the data that's out there and to interpret and find patterns from the data using summarization and visualization techniques. And I identify with the pragmatism paradigm. I believe in the compatibility between the worldviews and different methods. And now I want to talk about my techniques for data preprocessing, and I frame it as data preprocessing instead of data collection because, as I mentioned, it's different from what we understand about data collection in educational research traditionally. So I use social media scraping to collect data from social media with the help of API. API is application programming interface, so it's like a waiter in a restaurant that you takes your order of data and it goes into the company's repository and it gets your order of data for you. And I did not collect data from Twitter firsthand because COVID-19 Twitter data set already exists out there, actually multiple. And I chose this one by Benda et al. In 2020. They published a paper about how they get the data from Twitter in the first place. They use Stream API to capture all the tweets in English with the following keywords that I listed here. These keywords are mostly related to COVID-19. They've been sharing their daily files since early 2020 until the present day. And what I did is I also applied for the API. I hydrate and filter the tweets from May and September 2020 using education-related keywords that are listed here. Hydrate means to use API to get the full information about Twitter data. And in the future, I'll probably expand the time frame to the whole year of 2020. But for this pilot study, I only focus on 2 months. May is around the peak of school closure, and September is around the start of the new semester when the schools are more or less more prepared for a new mode of instruction. And so here I list some of the features that from the hydrated data set. So when we talk about social media data, we're not only talking about the posts themselves, but also many other interesting informations. In this study, I focus on created ad feature, which is the timestamp, full text, it's the tweet post themselves. And I also use user and in reply to user ID to construct this network that we will talk about later. Here, I specifically want to bring you attention to geo and coordinates features. And these are not available from the free version of API that I applied for, but these can be useful to actually frame this analysis or the Twitter data themselves in a specific geographic location. And then I start by basic quantitative analysis, starting with the descriptive analysis, the normal ones, counts, central tendencies, range, extremes. And I use cosine similarities to compare the top used words in different months. And this whole quantitative phrase is backed up by natural language processing. NLP is a very hot topic in data science and computer science nowadays, and it's to use algorithms and computational processing of human-generated language. And under NLP, there are multiple techniques. And in this study, I mostly use tokenization, backup words, stop words, and lemmatization. So tokenization is a way to divide text into analyzable units. It can be characters or words or phrase. Backup words is to put all the words used in the text in a bag without their context and to calculate the frequencies of the words. Stop words are used to filter out the common words that are functional but are less meaningful, like the, and appeared very often in the English language, but they are less meaningful or insightful from our analysis. These words need to be filtered out. Lemmatization is used to identify words of the same root, like ran, run, and running may mean similar things to us, but for the computer, it can mean completely different things if we don't use lemmatization. So for NLP, I use some freely available Python packages. This NLP backed up my whole quantitative analysis. And then I want to talk about my social network analysis. So before any network analysis, it's important to define what is the network that we mean. So network usually consists of nodes and edges. Nodes are the individuals in the network. So in this case, it's the Twitter user identified in my educational COVID dataset. The edges are usually mean the interactions and relationships between nodes. And in my case, I identified as the reply interactions. So my network is a directed network. This image shows a very simplified version of a directed network. So C has arrow pointing to B, for example. So C will be the replier in my study and B is replied in my study. So there are multiple measures under social network analysis. I definitely didn't use them all. And here are some examples. Geodesic distance is to measure the ease of one user to reach another in the network. Network density is a measure of overall connectedness of the network. Centrality measures are measures that used to identify important figures in the network. Modularity measures are used, it consists of multiple different methods. It can be used to identify some subgroups or cliques in the network. And I use the Gaffy software to help me with visualization and calculation of SNA. And then I want to briefly talk about my qualitative analysis because at this stage, I did not really delve deeper into the qualitative because that comes after I get more data. And for my qualitative analysis, I want to use discourse analysis, which means I want to explore the meanings of language in its broad sense in a concrete social context. Discourse analysis is usually interdisciplinary. I want to sample randomly tweets from with the common and meaningful words that are identified in the quantitative phrase. And I want to conduct open Excel coding of these tweets until I reach a theoretical saturation. The goal of this discourse analysis is to supplement and to explain my quantitative findings with qualitative themes. And here I present some preliminary findings of my descriptive analysis. I identified over 10K educational COVID tweets from these 2 months. September has more than double tweets that address educational issues in the COVID context. And the total number of the COVID tweets from the original data set that I pre-processed are 10K each day. So the total number of monthly COVID tweets should be similar in these 2 months that are related to education. So here we can safely draw the conclusion that more proportion of public attention on the pandemic were actually allocated to educational issues around the start of the new semester in September compared with earlier 2020 in May. And here, this image shows a pretty word cloud showing the most common words in the May tweets. So it's not surprising that COVID, school, and education appeared most often because these are actually keywords I use to filter the data. However, we see some other interesting terms such as Trump, government, and positive. So using the backup word techniques, these terms have lost their context. So it's necessary later to narrow our search for a more in-depth qualitative analysis once a focus is decided. So for example, if we want to see how people discuss Trump with regard to education in the pandemic context, we can definitely do that. And I looked at the commonalities between May and September, mostly in their top 25 most common words. So in their union, we have 33 words, and in their intersection, we have 17. So these 17 words appear as most common words in both months. Cosine similarity is 0.83, so it's very close to 1. So we can conclude that although September, people pay more attention to educational issues, September and May actually have, like, people mostly use the similar words in their tweets. And the table shows my preliminary findings from SNA. So it corresponds to my descriptive findings. In September, there are much more nodes and edges, meaning much more Twitter users are talking about education with related to the pandemic, and much more interactions were going on in September. And however, the network density is approaching 0. It's very low. So the overall connectedness of educational network is really low. And the average degree is also quite low, although there's a slight increase between from May and September. And the network diameter approaches 1 for both months, which means that most interactions happen on a one-on-one basis. There is less of a community feelings in the educational network on Twitter. The centrality measures tells us there are very few influential or important figures in the educational network, and only 0.01% of the users have a centrality measure of 1. It's basically neglectable. And modularity measures, which usually range from -1 to 1, we see that in both months it's very close to 1. So it means that people usually just talk to the other person or other users in the network without branching out to other people. And my discourse analysis findings actually do not come from May and September data because I haven't got the time for it. Here, I want to present some findings from Katie Elliott and my studies earlier. In 2020, we manually coded and filtered Twitter data that features support from late March 2020. Because 4 days of data is still manageable, so we manually coded them and reached a high inter-rater reliability. So we identified 2 subgroups. Informational subgroup features themes like resource sharing, technological, pedagogical knowledge, and practical advice, mostly about how to teach online. And nurturing group is less practical, less informational, but more features emotional support such as gratitude and appreciation for teachers, and encouragement is like sense of solidarity among teachers. And my discussions of preliminary findings, we see more education related discussions on Twitter in September compared to May. But the most used words and terms have high similarities in the 2 months. There are more networking happening in September than in May. The network features are similar in the 2 months in that if there are mostly one-on-one interactions, there were few influential figures. And in the early phase of the pandemic, from the discourse analysis, we see that the support network among educators feature informational support and nurturance support. So this study has some limitations and ethical considerations. Twitter users share certain demographic features, which means that my findings may not be generalizable to the public. And my findings also depends on the rigor of a regional COVID-19 dataset. There are concerns about illegitimate information online. My analysis also limited to my keywords, time frame, and English, and not considering the other forms of discourse such as images and video clips. And I also did not distinguish countries or regions. So my next step is to apply for the paid version of Twitter API if I can get dissertation funding to actually narrow this search in one country or region, most likely to be US. And there are some ethical considerations with social media data. social media users are not aware that their data are being used or being researched mostly. So in my study, I want to be cognizant of the fact and to try to protect their privacy. And since the time is limited, I want to discuss only about my methodological implications because I think that's the most important potential contributions my study can bring. So some researchers found that traditional methods, although they can be valuable for some inquiries, they can be time consuming, hard to repeat, unlimited in scale. And in my study, I made the effort to bring interdisciplinary analytical approaches from social sciences as well as data science to uncover patterns and insights from high volume longitudinal social media data source. So hopefully it can fill in the gap of our methodology, but also our understanding of ways of interaction online among educational stakeholders, also our understanding of social media discourse and its involvement. And on a higher level, we can explore more about the role of social media in these events of education in crisis. And that's it about my presentation. I welcome any questions and feedback from you.
Well, thank you, Yiyun. Our first question is from Dr. Phillips, who has asked, is API only for Twitter?
No, usually big companies have API. So Facebook, Instagram, like the well-structured companies usually have very mature API system that you can use. But Twitter's APIs are very easier to apply for compared with some others.
Dr. Connell, do you want to ask your question directly or should I read it?
Sure. I guess my question is, since you're looking at like the pandemic data on Twitter and its relation to the pandemic and education, is there a way to collect that same data pre-pandemic so that you could see where the trends change and where the upticks are, how the language might change during the pandemic compared to pre-pandemic?
You mean like to just search for education related tweets pre-pandemic? So if it's pre-pandemic, then
basically,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Then if it's pre-pandemic, then we probably the focus is too broad. I would say, like even now, I feel like my focus is very broad. So if pre-pandemic, we do not have may not have any keywords related to pandemic because it has not happened yet. So we can only maybe filter out some aspects under the educational tweets. So for example, we can narrow down the focus to online and remote teaching. That's something actually I'm very interested in, like how people talk about online education pre-pandemic compared to during pandemic and post-pandemic, and see how the public sentiment has kind of evolved because of the systematic changes brought by the pandemic with regard to a change of teaching learning modality. That's something that definitely we can do. Yeah.
We have time for one more question if there is one. Ms. Fan, you're getting wonderful accolades in the chat, so please make sure you take the time to review the feedback from your colleagues.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. With that, we take a deep breath and we shift to our second presenter today. Our second speaker is Dr. Van Truong, a 2020 graduate from the EdD and Educational Leadership and Management program, whose supervising professor for her research was Dr. Alonzo Flowers. Dr. Truong earned her EdD with a concentration in creativity and innovation. Van received her master's in secondary and special education from Chestnut Hill College and her BS in chemistry from Temple University. As an educational researcher, Van's dissertation research takes an equity and social justice orientation towards STEM education in urban public school settings. She explored STEM motivational pathways, particularly interventions that engage, support, and advance urban adolescent females of color in STEM educational programs and careers. Dr. Truong's research interests include equity, diversity, and inclusion in STEM, intersectionality and STEM, integrated STEM education, and more broadly, creativity and innovation in the educational field and workplace. Van has over 10 years of experience as an educator, where she has taught at the primary, secondary, and post-secondary grade levels for science education in both urban and suburban school environments. Van has also taught in various contexts, including alternative, private, and public schools. In addition to teaching, Van has served as an assessment and curriculum specialist, instructional coach, and professional development trainer. Outside of the education sphere, she has worked as a science research laboratory assistant, a program manager for a private tutoring firm, as well as a program coordinator for a youth mentoring program in the nonprofit sector. Dr. Van Truong's title, Bridging the Gap Between Urban Adolescent Females of Color and STEM, a hermeneutic phenomenological study. Over to you, Dr. Truong.
Thank you, Dr. Geller. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. If you can confirm that the screen looks okay.
You may want to switch the screen. We're seeing your notes.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Okay. Okay.
Well, Eric, any thoughts?
Yeah, let's see. There we go.
Oh, got it.
I just had to fix it a little. Alrighty. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you for being here. Today, I'm excited to share this space with you and to present my research project. As Dr. Geller mentioned, Bridging the Gap Between Urban Adolescent Females of Color in STEM, a hermeneutic phenomenological study. Before I begin my presentation, I'd like to acknowledge and thank my supervising professor, Dr. Flowers, and my committee members, Dr. Hazlip and Dr. Banda, for their incredible support throughout my dissertation journey. I'd also like to thank the leaders and participants of Program XXX. Here's an outline of my presentation. It shows the important sequence of the parts that make up my research, beginning with my background and positionality. I'd like to start with providing you with some background information about me as a means to better understand the why behind my research and the purpose of my research. So my family and I are refugees of the Vietnam War. We immigrated to the United States in the early 1990s. I grew up in upstate New York and later moved to Philadelphia. I am a product of the Philadelphia public school system. I'm also a former science major who studied chemistry during my undergraduate years. And my journey into education began through my role as a program coordinator with a mentoring program, working with students who were deemed at risk with the Boys and Girls Clubs of Philadelphia and a local high school. While in this program, I had the opportunity to join a teacher preparation program with the School District of Philadelphia. And upon completing that program, I accepted a teaching position at the middle school level. I worked as a middle school science teacher for a year and then later moved up to high school teaching science. And collectively, I've been in education for approximately 11 years, serving as a science educator, curriculum assessment specialist, and an instructional coach. And it is through these experiences where my interest in this study emerged. As the researcher of this study, I identify and subscribe to the paradigms of social constructivism and pragmatism. And it is my hope that in practice, this study will assist educators, STEM program leaders, community leaders, as well as parents to support females of color who are interested in pursuing STEM education and careers with proactive tools that further support their holistic selves. To provide you with some background information, the research shows that there's a growing concern about the lack of diversity in the fields of STEM. There's also a high need to recruit more STEM workers to fill jobs. In fact, a recent report released by the United States Department of Commerce noted that by 2025, there will be approximately 3.5 million STEM jobs that will need to be filled. So researchers have suggested that one way to address the STEM worker shortage is to increase diversity in the STEM fields. And as such, my research explored the underrepresentation of females of color namely African American and Latinx females. The purpose of my study was to explore the lived experiences of urban adolescents, females of color within the context of an out-of-school time STEM program. Moreover, my study sought to understand the perceptions of urban adolescent females of color academic growth as it relates to the STEM program and their in-school math and science classes. I developed several research questions to guide my study. My primary research question, how do the lived experiences in an out-of-school time STEM program influence the STEM learning and personal interests in pursuing STEM educational programs and professions for urban adolescent females of color? I also developed 4 sub-questions. The first sub-question, how do urban adolescent females of color who attended an out-of-school time STEM program describe their perceptions about the barriers and challenges they have faced in STEM? The second sub-question, how did participating in an out-of-school time STEM program influence urban adolescent females of color perceptions of their ability to do science and math? The third sub-question, how do urban adolescent females of color who attended an out-of-school time STEM program understand STEM career pathways? And the last sub-question, how do the lived experiences of urban adolescent females of color who participated in an out-of-school time STEM program influence their personal interests in pursuing STEM educational programs and professions? Figure 1 here shows the conceptual framework with the theoretical frame and literature on research and practice of the 3 streams. So in alignment with the research questions, several theories were identified to guide my research. My study draws on theory from Delgado's critical race theory, Delgado's critical race feminism, Crenshaw's intersectionality methodological framework, and Latson-Billings' critical race theory in education. In particular, the interconnectedness of these frameworks were useful for understanding the phenomena experienced by females of color in STEM. Additionally, in an effort to better understand past and current recruitment initiatives, I also explored some of the practices that have been successful at recruiting girls. These practices include, for example, access to equitable K-12 STEM education, building STEM identity and a strong sense of voice, and increased support systems. Furthermore, I also explored how STEM Bridge programs can be used to support females of color persistent interest and participation in STEM. And in particular, I used Lev and Wenger's situated learning theory as a lens to explore informal STEM learning, particularly students' learning experiences in out-of-school time STEM programs. My study focused on one specific out-of-school time STEM program, namely Program XXX, located in a metropolitan area in the northeastern region of the United States. And to give you some context about the program, it is an all year round STEM education program that recruits students from the local urban school district. Students who participate in the program are first nominated by their 8th grade teacher. Once accepted into the program, they are asked to remain in the program for their full high school career. So from 9th grade all the way until they graduate all the way up until they graduate high school. And the program engages students in STEM learning, exposes them to STEM career activities, as well as partners them with mentors, and they also engage in social building activities. With regards to the sample of the study consisted of 8 adolescent girls. The criteria for selection included the participant one must be 15 to 21 years of age, self-identified as an urban female of color, currently enrolled in or have graduated from the program, and then lastly, express interest and willingness to participate in the program. Table 1 below shows the participants of the study. Column 1 shows their pseudonym, and I'd just like to note here that these pseudonyms represent historical females of color figures in STEM, and they were either self-selected by the participants, or I selected these names for the participants based on her career interests. The second column here shows the participants' race, the third column their grade level, and then the last column the type of school that the participant attended during the study, at the time of the study. So the philosophical underpinnings that inform my study were phenomenology and hermeneutics. Through methods grounded in hermeneutic phenomenology, I collected data through one semi-structured interviews, and this was done to explore the essence of the lived experiences of the participants. Also field observations to allow me to better facilitate an understanding of the setting. And lastly, review of documents to gather insights into the program, as well as to better understand the participants. With the collected data, it was coded using Littman's 3 C's model, and then following the coding process, a thematic analysis was conducted, informed by Diekelman to identify emergent themes. Table 2 here shows the alignment of the research questions to the interview questions. And so the interviews were conducted in 3 parts. In the first part of the interview, the participants were asked to reflect on their past K-12 STEM experiences. In the second part of the interview, the participants were asked to reflect on their experiences in the program XXX. And in the last part of the interview, the participants were asked to reflect on their experiences in other STEM programs, as well as provide their recommendations for advancing females of color participation in STEM. With regards to the study's findings, triangulation of the data showed the emergence of 4 overarching themes and 16 sub-themes that connected the experiences of the participants. The themes are aligned to the research questions shown here in Figure 5, and the overarching themes include STEM barriers, STEM learning, STEM career pathways, and STEM career attraction. And in the next slide, I'll be discussing the themes in more detail. Here are some of the participants' response. And with regards to research question number 1, one of the participants shared her experience with racial ethnic bias. And so I'd like to read this quote that she shared in her reflection. "The school that I came from, I just never really felt smart. Like I never felt extraordinarily smart. I didn't realize that I was smart until I came to this school, where there were more Black people and there were these teachers that saw me. I felt as if I was being seen. That actually helped. That actually promoted me to do better in school. Not saying that I was a bad student, but the idea that the teacher was seeing that I was smart helped me perform better." With regards to research question number 2 and number 3, the participants noted that participating in the out-of-school time STEM program exposed them to informal STEM learning, which helped to increase their interest in STEM, and also through the support of teachers, as well as gaining peer support, that too assisted with their STEM learning and their STEM interest and participation in STEM career activities. Moreover, having an increased self-awareness and confidence as a result of participating in the out-of-school times program, that too has helped to build their STEM interest and participation in STEM. And lastly, with regards to recommendations for advancing females of color's participation in STEM, all of the participants noted the importance of early exposure to STEM education and activities. And so one of the participants' response here noted, "One thing I feel is that a lot of STEM programs shouldn't start in 9th grade. I feel like certain STEM programs should be at least start at 8th grade or 6th grade. That gives them a really long time to fully understand if they want to be in the science field or not." Overall, so the findings in this study suggest the following factors that decrease urban females of color early childhood interest and participation in STEM include racial ethnic bias, gender bias, disparities in access to K-12 STEM education and activities,
See you.
Negative STEM perceptions, discouragement from teachers. Factors that had the most influence on urban females of color interest and participation in STEM included parents, particularly mothers, school teachers, particularly female of colors school teachers, peer support, STEM program leaders, and having mentors and role models. Additionally, the out-of-school time STEM program supported urban females of color learning of STEM and STEM development. And these included increased self-awareness and confidence through social engagement activities, exposure to informal STEM learning and career activities, flexibility in learning, and access to STEM mentors, role models, as well as peer support networks. In addition to the interviews, I conducted 3 separate observations. These observations included observing student participants during the process of STEM learning. And through the observations, it was found that females of color thrive in learning environments that support participation of students from diverse backgrounds, as well as the implementation of the practices shown here in Figure 4. So for example, exposure to informal STEM learning, culturally relevant teaching, hands-on project-based curriculum, collaborative group work, STEM career activities, and social enrichment activities. Based upon the findings of my study, the following recommendations are offered for educators. 1, examine biases and practices and reflect. And so a quote that I like to share is, reflective teachers are more likely to develop reflective learners. 2, consider adopting the teaching practices outlined in Figure 4 in classrooms. 3, create flexible, informal STEM learning opportunities for students within and outside of the classroom. 4, develop systems to support females of color learning of STEM. For example, peer tutoring and integration of technology tools and supplemental resources. Offer encouragement to help females of color develop their STEM identity. And lastly, encourage out-of-school time STEM activities and programs. For example, STEM Bridge programs, mentorship programs, competitions, and trips to STEM museums or sites. And I like to note here that as a STEM educator, I've engaged in introducing all of these resources to my students, and they have been incredible for the students' STEM development, increasing their STEM interests and engagement in STEM activities. Also, there are some recommendations offered here for policymakers. So 1, promote and legislate policies that support the inclusion of minoritized students. For example, STEM Supporting Minority STEM Student to Career Act, STEM Opportunities Act, and Women and Minorities in STEM Booster Act are just a few that currently exist. Promote and legislate policies in support of district and site-based initiatives to increase sustainable STEM learning and interest for females of color through their K-12 education. Increase monetary accountability and incentives for initiatives geared towards increasing females of color participation in STEM, such as scholarships, internships, apprenticeships. Increase funding support towards research on the factors that discourage or encourage females of color to engage in STEM activities, and establish and fund STEM bridge and mentorship programs that work directly with urban school districts to recruit and retain students of color, including females of color. Implications for future research. So the implications derived from the findings show that while this study is important in highlighting the participants' perceptions of how participating in an out-of-school time STEM program may prepare them for future STEM learning, future research recommendations point to the need to examine the 3 areas outlined here. So for example, long-term impacts of participating in out-of-school time STEM programs. So future course taking patterns, persistence in STEM related courses, choice of college majors and or career, and experiences in STEM career. 2, a broader exploration of multiple barriers to STEM success and their intersections, such as detailed assessment of students' perceptions of role models, social support, advanced STEM courses, and institutional resources. And 3, the impact of parental involvement and school support on underrepresented groups, science and math learning. The research recommendations can be extended to other underrepresented groups in STEM, including boys of color, and of course, other ethnic groups. And lastly, obtaining this type of data will allow researchers to evaluate findings and draw comparisons between groups. In conclusion, I'd like to note that although the findings in the study show that the participation in STEM enrichment programs is a step towards increasing interest in pursuing STEM careers and participation in STEM educational programs for females of color, it is not enough to ensure their participation in the STEM fields. Females of color need intentional support and guidance within and outside of the school environment. And ensuring that females of color are supported in K-12 and beyond provides a basis for dismantling systemic and structural barriers and reducing the gender and racial ethnic disparities that exist in the STEM sphere. I'd like to note that it's important, however, we consider the educational needs of females of color, but that is also, it's also important to consider the educational needs of all students. And to this point, Milgram Alcott asserted that we need to create the next generation of innovators that can drive solutions to our biggest challenges, and we must foster everyone's unique creativity and brilliance. And I'd like to end with this quote. So as a means to reflect on the importance of STEM education for all of our students, and to encourage that science is more than a school subject or the periodic table or the properties of waves. It is an approach to the world, a critical way to understand and explore and engage with the world, and then have the capacity to change that world. Thank you for your participation, and I welcome any questions and feedback.
At this point, we'll take questions for Dr. Truong from attendees. You can either use your mic or post them.
I put a question in the chat, but I'll say it out loud. This is a very important study. I think you did a super job with the study and with the presentation. Can you talk a little bit more about how you may have carried this work forward after you graduated?
Yes, absolutely. I first want to say that the journey into my dissertation has significantly informed my practice as an educator. I have reflected on my approach to teaching STEM, my interactions with students, the resources that I bring to the classroom, as well as the resources that I may not be bringing into the classroom that should be brought into the classroom. And so I have been working to develop a better experience for my students with teaching and learning in the classroom, as well as developing partnerships to bring in resources with local universities, STEM organizations, making sure that they have access to these career activities, mentors if possible, role models. It's important for them to see individuals that look like them, that they can identify with, to get feedback from those individuals. And I think one of the important things that I learned in my study with students that I didn't realize before conducting the study was that how students envision what STEM professionals look like is incredibly important. And I asked the participants in my study, prior to participating in the STEM program, what did they think a STEM professional looked like? And many of them shared, the stereotypical image of a STEM professional. And I found that that feedback was similar to my students in my own classroom. And so just, exposing students to STEM professionals that they can identify with and that look like them is incredibly important. And I think that was something that I found significant in my research. I've also engaged in recruiting students to STEM bridge programs and ensuring that that serves as a foundation for them to get access to STEM education, as well as access to internships and support following that. I think that too is very important. So, once they graduate from the program, it's important that we follow through with the students to make sure that they remain in the program or continue their pathway into a STEM career.
Thank you.
Dr. Connell?
Yeah, it's a bit of a long question, but it gets around to really policy and funding issues. And I guess, and maybe you have this data, and if you presented it earlier, I apologize. But if you were to say, like, for students who attend a first year of college, let's say that there's 100 white males that attend college, you could identify which programs they go into, right? How many of them went into STEM, how many went into design, how many went into engineering or medicine, something. And then you could get the percentage that were in STEM related fields, right? So you have your total sample and then the sample that went into a STEM related field. Do you have that data that you could then show that of females of color who attend their first year of college, right? That big group, that this percentage attend STEM related fields, because that gap would show that there's a disproportionate representation, an underrepresentation of females of color in a STEM related field. And you may have already done this, and I apologize, but right, that helps sort of drive, right, the need for funding and policy initiatives to increase that capacity.
Yes, absolutely. In my dissertation, I actually referenced this with the statistics behind participation of females of color in specifically in the technology and engineering sectors. Collectively, it was noted in the literature that they make up like less than 10% in that field. And so I agree with you that that would be important to introduce to funders to maybe share with them the importance of recruiting more females of color into this field and the importance of diversifying the STEM fields.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you.
Van, I had a question. You mentioned on one of your slides that parents are a key influence of females of color going into STEM. Any thoughts about how you then work with the parents to encourage that?
Yes, absolutely. As an educator, I believe that it's incredibly important that we establish positive relationships with our parents. That's one of the first things I do at the beginning of the year, is to reach out to parents. And with that, I share with them, the course that I teach is chemistry, and it's going to be challenging for our students. But I think that it's important for parents to be engaged in the learning process. So sharing with them first the background of the course, resources, and then inviting them to events if the student is interested in pursuing a STEM career, as well as sharing with them maybe some program opportunities that they can engage the students in outside of the classroom. As for example, while I was teaching in Philadelphia, and I love teaching in Philadelphia because the universities in Philadelphia have dedicated so much efforts to expanding programs to our students of color. And so the programs would be brought into the schools, but unfortunately not a lot of students know about them. So I think it's important that as educators, we encourage our students to look up those programs and participate, but it's even more incredibly important that we inform parents about it, because we do need their support outside of the classroom to encourage the students to take part in those programs. And a lot of times it's informing them about it, and then potentially, if they need support in filling out any paperwork or financial assistance, maybe we can offer some resources there as well. But overall, having parents support through this process to ensure that the student is getting the best of their STEM education and receiving those necessary resources to thrive in STEM, we would definitely need the support of the parent or the guardian.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Dr. Van Truong, for your wonderful presentation and your response to the questions. I want to thank Ms. Yiyun Kate Fan for your wonderful presentation and taking of the questions. I want to thank everybody for attending today, and please mark your calendar for the last Doctoral Student Colloquium event of the academic year, Friday, May 7th, from noon to 1 p.m. See everybody there.